Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody on the call, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us here in this latest Basis Technologies webinar in our regular series of webinars about DevOps and test automation for SAP. As you can see on the screen, today we're going to be talking about end-to-end testing. And my colleague Jim, who's with me, I'll introduce in a second, is going to posit a perhaps slightly controversial view, but you'll see why later in the webinar. Before we begin, as always, a little bit of webinar admin. Everybody on the call is on mute today, as is normal in these things, but you should see a question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. So we would encourage you to enter any questions you may have in that box, and we'll get to as many of those as we have time for at the end of the session. We're going to aim to run for about 45 minutes today, probably. So we'll see how many we can get through. This is a recorded session, as always, in Basis Technologies webinars. So a link to the recording will be sent out after the webinar is finished, probably within the next day or two. So if you do want to get that link to share it or to review any of this content that we're going to go through, if you don't see it, do please let us know either through your website or through the contact details later on in the webinar, and we'll make sure to get that to you. Okay, so let's begin. I think a good place to start is with the wonderful new world of video. You can see the names on the screen there already, but we'll throw the slide up there. Those of you who've joined Basis Technologies webinars in the past may well recognize my voice, if not my face. I'm Peter Yabsley. I'm the head of product marketing here at Basis, and I'm typically involved in quite a lot of these things, but the most important person who's with me today, who's joining us from our office in Dallas, Texas, is Mr. Jim Duggar. Jim, thanks for joining us.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So as I've mentioned, Jim's the most important component really of this webinar, because he has an extensive background in the world of software testing, and in particular SAP testing, and he's going to be talking to us about this idea of end-to-end and how we might look at that a bit differently. Before we begin, let's just have a quick look at today's agenda, very high level. We're going to start by looking at what end-to-end testing is and why it's such a common practice, really just kind of level set to make sure we're all talking about the same thing here. And then we're going to look at some of the pros and cons of that approach, which will no doubt be familiar to many people on the call. But I think most importantly for today's webinar, we're going to discuss an alternative way of looking at things and some technology that can help you to do that and try and minimize the amount of end-to-end testing that you need to do. And as I said, time permitting, we'll have some Q&A at the end. We'll go through as much as we can. Before we get into the real meat of it, a quick introduction to Basis Technologies for any of you on the call who may not be so familiar with us as a company. We've been around for about 20 years, and what we do is we create software automation tools that help our customers to run, to maintain, to adapt their SAP systems more effectively. And one of the ways that we've been able to do that, particularly in recent years, is to help them to bring concepts like DevOps and continuous automation and automated testing into those SAP environments. So what we offer today is the most complete DevOps and test automation platform that's specifically engineered for SAP, and that's the really important part, and it's something we're going to touch on in today's conversation from a technical point of view, taking into account that uniqueness of SAP and the way it works. We are very much a global company. We've got offices all over the world. As I've mentioned, Jim's in Dallas. I'm based in the UK. We have offices in Europe and down in Sydney, Australia, covering the APAC region, and customers all over the world as well. You can see a few of them on the screen now, running from some of the world's biggest users of SAP who've really heavily invested in automation, not just from Basis Technologies, but from other vendors, to other large companies who maybe have a smaller SAP estate, but they're still seeing a lot of value from employing automation in those landscapes to help them run more efficiently. And as you can see, our products are SAP certified, and we're an SAP Silver partner. So we've been around a long while, and really this is what we do, and this is our specialty. So let's begin. We're going to talk about end-to-end testing today, as I mentioned. Jim, you and I, some time back, I think now, we ran a webinar about kind of the other side to today's coin, which is this idea of risk-based testing. But that concept is really much more about trying to figure out what you're able to test, and more pertinently, what resources you've got and how you can use them to test most effectively. Really what we're talking about with end-to-end testing is more on the execution side of things, how we might do it. So just before we begin, as I said, let's have a bit of a level set, make sure we're all talking about the same thing. What do you mean when you're talking about end-to-end testing in an environment like SAP?
So yeah, I want to define end-to-end testing, but let's not leave risk-based testing untouched. It's interesting that you brought that topic up because end-to-end, frankly, created the opportunity for risk-based testing to become a thing. So when I think of end-to-end testing, what I'm thinking about is a test sequence that performs an entire business process. This would typically be multi-actor, meaning different individuals in the organization, and probably cross a variety of different variances that exist within that business process in order to ensure that some distribution of it were capable of effectively working, right? So if we take a very, very simple order to cash example, it would be from VAO1 to the delivery to finally to the invoicing across the different actors that perform each of those different steps. It might even include things like supply chain or inventory management as well, because those oftentimes provide prerequisite data in order to make that process work. And so the end-to-end test is this thing that verifies that across the entire spectrum of people that depend on the underlying ERP, they will in fact be functional after a change. Now, where risk-based testing fits into this, and we're going to spend some time talking about this in the presentation today at length, but where risk-based testing fits in is that this is very expensive when done at scale. Those of us that know longer running business processes that are much more complicated, procure to pay, hire to fire, these kinds of things, know that there is no sense in performing them, especially if you're doing mostly manual testing, if you haven't made a change in that particular discipline of the ERP system, or at least that's the theory behind risk-based testing. The reality is a little bit different. But risk-based testing became a thing here because end-to-end is so voluminous in terms of what it asks of the testing team to actually do, that trying to reduce the amount of testing that was required for any particular change also became a thing. And this is what we mean by end-to-end testing, this whole end-to-end perspective of a business process.
Okay, which makes perfect sense. I'm sure that's no surprise to anybody on the call, but we're all at least making sure we're speaking the same language. And before we dig into that, I know we've talked about this more kind of global approach of how we come at this, whether it's risk-based testing or otherwise. But I know that the specific methodology of end-to-end isn't the only bugbear you have. I know that that you also believe that we should be coming at the whole concept of testing almost in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at how testing works outside of an ERP system, the dominant body of tests and the total test count is even down at the code level, what's called a unit test, where we've got assertions and functional predictions about how each method call should actually function. Now, in a business system, we're going to flip that a little bit upside. We're going to say it should be the business activity. But the point is that it is this small, discrete test that can live on its own. It's highly diagnostic. After all, if creating an order fails, you know that creating an order is failing. You don't have this massive end-to-end where you have to go find why the test failed and those kinds of things. And there's a lot more of those, and there's some integration testing, and then finally you have what we call smoke testing, which is actually what end-to-end is really, really good at, which is making sure the giant assembly right before it goes from pre-prod into production is actually fully assembled, fully connected, and everything's really working. But if we look at testing that's done for ERP systems, what we tend to see is very little activity level testing, quite a bit of integration testing, and then most customers trying to build their large amount of their test library with these end-to-end tests, which have all kinds of disadvantages that we're going to get to. But primarily, a couple of problems happen. We've gone from a very diagnostic, a very durable, and that means it doesn't break, a very simple test case that we've got lots of, and we've replaced them with relatively fewer tests that have a whole long runtime because they're doing these massive end-to-end processes. And because they are inherently smoke tests, they depend on the entire infrastructure to be in place. And so we're not doing any testing at all from a functional standpoint for our business until right before production, which is entirely too late to be doing these kinds of things. The one advantage they really do have is that they are of the user's perspective, but we're going to talk about a way to fix that particular problem here in just a second. But absolutely, this triangle is upside down in terms of what testing and when that we do it.
So actually connecting there then very closely, and I know we'll come on to it later, to that idea of DevOps and the centrality of shifting quality left in that kind of DevOps or more continuous delivery type approach. So although we're going to talk about specifically end-to-end today and an alternative to it, it can have, you know, bigger ramifications and benefits in this overall approach to testing as well.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I would like to get into some of the advantages and disadvantages of end-to-end, because I think that's where we really explore when to use them, why to use them, what they're best at, and what the other good opportunities are.
Well, let's do just that. You know, you've mentioned this is the way most testing is done, particularly in systems like SAP. It's been around a long time. There's going to be some good reasons why people are using it. Let's talk about those for a second.
Sure. I think the primary reason end-to-end is a big thing is because all the test vendors have prescribed it. We'll get into the reasons why in a minute, but that's really why it became a very big thing and the standard prescription for how to do testing. But there are some keen advantages of it, and they all relate to its role as being, frankly, the very best smoke testing methodology possible, even if it's not a very good regression testing methodology. So the first key advantage is they're logical. No matter what I'm testing, if I ask myself, what does my end user need to do, and I prepare a test that is from that, I've got a fairly useful entity, right? I've got something that's actually going to help verify that the end user is going to be able to do their work and do their job and likely be successful after a change. And so that in itself is very interesting and very valuable. And one of the reasons, no doubt, end-to-end is popular. It makes sense. And if we think about manual testing especially, it makes a ton of sense. But here's the reason why I think it's even more common, especially as we start looking at the automation vendors, is that it solves for a test data management problem, okay? So when I design an end-to-end test, and mind you, I prescribed this as well for many years and have been doing it for a long time. I've been a test practitioner since my early days of C++ on OS2, and that pretty much dates me as much as anything. But when I would do it, what I would do is create these tests that would go prepare all of their prerequisite data and then go do the tests that I wanted, okay? Because what I didn't want was a test with an unpredictable dependency on the state of the system or the underlying condition of the code. What I wanted was to create all of my required prerequisites to validate that my test was working. And so if we think about back to this OTC example, right? It's simple, but it's a great example. If I want to do a delivery, I have to have a completed order. Well, if you go do a bunch of delivery tests, it's likely you could burn up all of your orders that are in the system and not have any orders to go do them, right? Thus breaking your test. So from an automated test designer's perspective, I would always perform an order first, retain that order number, then move into the delivery transaction and reuse that order that I just created. That way I had something in hand that I knew was going to work. And so that's one thing that end-to-end does well. The other thing that it does really well is your full system integration. And so if we look beyond ERP, and and this webinar is mostly about just within SAP itself, but if we look beyond ERP, we look at the customer that's placing an order and managing the customer relationships in Salesforce, that's actually generating a VA01 and the VL01N and the invoicing inside of SAP, that's perhaps using Manhattan to do their warehouse and supply chain management. These sort of composite conglomerations of several different ERP systems together, and you want to make sure that the business process across all of those completely different applications is still working. Okay, yeah, end-to-end rocks at that, and that's where we should use it. But frankly, you don't do that testing until exactly right before you go into production. For all of your other code development, for all of your other regular business as usual change in SAP, why wait that long? Why depend on those kinds of tests, which frankly are testing a bunch of stuff that's not related to the change you made anyway? Why do that, and why wait that long? So those are what I see as advantages, but also to some degree a few of the drawbacks of end-to-end.
Well, we've covered the pluses. Let's look at the minuses, because I think if they didn't already guess from the title of the webinar, our audience on today's call are going to have got a feeling that end-to-end is not your favorite flavor if there's another way to go. So let's look at the downsides that are involved as well, and talk through some of the key ones there.
Well, and they are many. And if we have test practitioners on the call, they're going to know a lot of these, and they're going to know them very well. So let's start with the idea of non-value add work. This is a business process concept that basically describes all of this activity that's necessary but doesn't bring any value to anyone. And let's go use our OTC example to prove that point. Let's say I've made a change to invoicing, and I want to thoroughly test my invoicing capabilities. Using end-to-end tests, I'm going to first place an order. I'm going to then do the delivery, and finally, I'll actually eventually get to do my testing of my invoicing, right? So I've got all this upfront prerequisite work or non-value add activity that's not purposeful to my goal. However, it was necessary in order to achieve it. And why was it necessary? Because I have to have test data in place. I have to have all these things in order to be able to do that. Well, for a manual tester, this is misery. This is, 2/3 of the transactions you want to test in this business process aren't germane to what you're trying to determine. It's just non-value add activity, right? And related to this is this idea that the tests become very complicated. After all, if I'm looking at a business activity that's sort of at the end of the process, or that's a benefactor or a secondary element of business process execution, I have to do a ton of this upfront prerequisite work in order to be able to reliably get there with the system in a state that is ready for me to be able to perform a test against the changes that I'm making. So they become very complicated, very long running, doing lots of unnecessary work and lots of unnecessary activities. The other problem is, if we look at where they fail, they will on average fail in the front half of the business process more often. And the simple reason why is if you have a test that's going to break and it has exactly equal odds of breaking in any one given activity, in the front half of the process is going to be most of the time, because you never get to the back half of the processes because your breaks happen early. Now, in computer science, we have this concept around select blocks and things like this, where we talk about things getting starved at the end of the array or at the end of the vector. And the same thing happens in testing here, where because the tests tend to break in the front half of the end-to-end processes, again, going back to OTC, we tend to do a very relatively good job of testing VA01 and a relatively poor job of testing, something like VF01 or MIGO or something else like this that's fairly far downstream, right? So especially for our manual test teams, we just run out of time before we get to those activities that they're at the end of the business process, and they tend to become more problematic in production simply because they're not getting the test and attention that they need. But it gets worse. And this is probably my favorite reason why I don't think end-to-end is great as your primary or even most potent part of your test methodology, and that's this idea of combinatorial explosion. In the risk-based testing webinar, I spent some time talking about this concept and cyclomatic complexity and other things that us developers have used over the years to try to make testing more resilient and more useful. But the biggest problem is, if I look at 10 different variances in all three of these activities, VA01, VL01, and VF01, or something like basic like this in OTC, I have 30 different potential tests that I need to write to try those 10 different variances in each of those activities. If I combine them together into an end-to-end process, I have a much, much larger range of variants simply because I'm multiplying all the different steps together. And in fact, I may be creating situations where I have to do quite a number of very special types of VA01s in order to even get to a particular type of a VF01. And I'm waiting for the hands to go up right now in the question box about this. But if we are planning end-to-end versus planning individual activities, that's where you see this thing take shape. And no one does comprehensive, exhaustive end-to-end testing because of exactly this problem. You literally have millions of variants in a typical customer environment, where maybe if you're doing it on an activity level, you might just have thousands. This is exactly the problem. And we talked about the last one here, which is because end-to-end depends on a complete assembly that's ready to go live and go into production, a fully integrated assembly. It's inherently doing things across the entire infrastructure. You cannot shift left. You have a dependency on the full production-like environment before you can begin your very first test. Now, as a developer, to me, that's way too late. I would much rather know that I've made simple mistakes or violated an assertion that was important to a piece of code that I've written, well, frankly, before the transport left dev, much less, wait all the way until pre-prod to get that information and be trying to remediate these issues before release with a fire built under my office chair, right? So to me, this is also a big disadvantage of end-to-end, is it's just too late in order to get the information that we need.
Okay, that's all fine. Lots of downside, and maybe a lot of that isn't new. Maybe some of it's thought-provoking, but we live in a high-tech world. I'll step away from the kind of neutral compare role for a second and challenge your narrative here in the sense of there's lots of automation out there today. Doesn't the automation we have solve those problems for us?
Well, to a degree. Fundamentally, what automation today, at least most of the automation out there, is it just tries to mechanize an existing bad idea. My opinion, but absolutely that's what's happening. What we see is, instead of having to do a lot of manual effort, having to have these long-running tests that are very complicated, we just simply script those and automate them. And so they break at the same level of frequency, in fact, more often, because they're being run more frequently now. And so you've just replaced all the effort of manual testing with effort of having a bunch of test engineers constantly write and maintain scripts that worry about prerequisite data, all of the maintenance, all the change, the scripts breaking all the time. And it's even a more complex problem than with manual testing, where you at least have typically agents that are quite familiar with the business process performing it and can naturally adapt to the ebb and flow of change in the system as it goes through its life cycle. So I've worked with automated testing for a very long time, and using end-to-end methodologies. If a customer can get to 15-20% coverage, they've been very, very successful with their automation library. After all, these are very complex tests, and they take quite a bit of effort and constant maintenance in order to maintain. And this incomplete coverage problem is another issue with the way that existing automation approaches end-to-end, because as I've learned and like to say, it is never the happy path that brings down production. Well,
I've never heard you say that, Jim. Never heard you say.
Because of the combinatorial explosion problem, what you tend to do with end-to-end and automation with it is just cover the happy path. Hey, that's a smoke test. That's not a regression test. That's a smoke test, and it's very valuable, and you absolutely should do it right before you go live in production. But it's not the right answer for basic regression, which is really the point of this. And then the last reason that automation doesn't really fulfill its promises is it's expensive. It just simply takes a lot of labor, a lot of work, and constant maintenance, and the tools themselves aren't cheap. So you add all of that together, and yeah, it's better than doing things manually a lot of times, but not a lot better, at least the way it's typically used with end-to-end.
Okay, so we've talked about a problem, and we've decided that the traditional technology that's out there doesn't help you solve it. So not going to be a very useful webinar if we cut things off at this point. So let's move on and let's talk about this alternative approach, or a different way that people can come at this challenge of SAP regression testing that's going to help them to reduce that burden of end-to-end.
Okay.
So you've got three points on the screen here that kind of posit a high-level different approach. Take us through that and the process next that relates to.
Well, the first and most simple part of this is I'm going to propose that we adopt a unit testing-like methodology to our business processes. So that means we're going to be testing at the business activity level, which in SAP is roughly the transaction or the T code. And we're going to do those tests at that level as a whole test, as opposed to trying to stitch together full business processes across the entire system. So that's going to simplify our combinatorial explosion problem. That's going to simplify the test creation itself, simply because it's just one T code, right? The second thing I'm going to recommend that we do is model them after what real users actually do. One of the problems, especially with manual testing, is it tends to be an idealized test, and it's not actually how users in the field are using the system to get real work done. So we'll get into the automation part of this, but this is a place where automation can really help by recording the user's desktop or activity at the server level in order to automate that. But the worst case is, let's do a time and motion study, put a video camera over their shoulder and watch them actually perform the process, right, and get a few variations. So the last thing, and this is related to that topic, is because we're not doing these very complicated tests, we've got an opportunity to be able to provide good coverage across the variances that we see in performance of each of those different business activities and T-codes that they're doing. And so, of course, this is the holy grail of testing, to be able to provide very, very good regression coverage so that when you do a change, you can ask the question, did I break the way my users depend on this system today? And that's exactly what we want to achieve here.
Okay, so let's just take a quick look. I know we've got on the next slide of what that might look like.
Yep. So, you know, what many of us have done for many years is understand business process in a horizontal fashion. And I'm sure everyone on this call has been in one of those conference rooms that the walls were covered in sticky notes with lines drawn between them, right? As we're mapping out our business processes and understanding how all of these things work. So what I'm going to propose in order to get this activity level picture, and you could do this with manual testing or you can do it with automation, like we'll show you in a minute. What I'm going to propose is that instead of looking at the business process horizontally, we flip that up on its end and look at business process across a time slice of a business day, not across the long running process. So let's take that from the perspective of, again, our simple order to cash business process. This one's especially suitable for this methodology because at any moment in an ERP system, we're likely to have thousands of these processes in flight at one time. And if we look at the in-flight processes, let's imagine maybe just a Tuesday morning or maybe a Wednesday that we do a recording. We are likely to see an instance of any of those business activities involved in those business processes in that window. And in fact, they're all at a different point, a different life cycle, a different state in the execution. So for example, even though I'm not seeing one full end-to-end execution, I absolutely am seeing an order being amended, a delivery being made, an order being placed, and an invoice for a completed order being performed by users in the real system at that point in time. I have every type of activity, but now I'm looking at it in a much more narrow, much more vertical slice, and I've created discrete opportunities to be able to go re-execute each of those business activities as opposed to having to perform the full end-to-end process. And frankly, I think it's worth challenging me on how, because
well,
a little bit of a trick.
I'm sure, you know, we should acknowledge as well what a leap this is in terms of reorientation of mindset. I know from many of the conversations that I've been involved with customers and when I've been listening to you talk to them, this is really a different way of looking at it, going from saying I've tested every part of a process from end to end in one flow to I've tested every part of that process at some point, and therefore de facto I can be confident in the overall. So let's talk about the technical aspect, because I'm sure there are people with questions in mind in the audience, and I think the first thing you want to touch on is this is one of those possibly rare occasions when the architecture and the uniqueness of SAP can be a benefit to us.
It is, and so what we're really talking about doing is testing a day in the life of the business as opposed to thinking about it as end-to-end processes, right? That's really what we're doing. And unlike other software systems, SAP comes pre-equipped with a methodology and a practice that's common that is perfectly suited for solving the testing problem this way, and that is the system copy. So the premise of the system copy, and I'm sure everyone here has done one, is that we take a copy of our production environment from a known point in time and go replicate that data into QA, where now we have a QA environment that reflects production from a known moment in the business life cycle, right? And so all of those in-flight prerequisites that we needed in order to be able to test just a delivery or just an amended order or just an invoice or place a new order, all of those prerequisites are already in the system. Because after all, we've taken a copy of our production environment from a known point in time. And in my history of software development, again, mostly outside of SAP, I've never had anything like this. I think it was one of the neatest features of SAP to be able to start us off at a known moment in time and not have to worry about all the data prerequisites and challenges that come with that are typical of other kinds of software systems. But the challenge that we have is then identifying each one of those. How do I find the VAO2 that makes sense for the type of change that I've made? Or pick your transaction at this point. How do we go about identifying each of those prerequisites and figuring out which test we should run against which order numbers, which delivery numbers, and so on and so on. And I'm going to get into that in just a second, because I think this is a place where automation can actually pay a huge dividend, as opposed to just executing tests for us. I think automation should know what the test should be and help us identify it and then execute it. And we'll talk about that here in just a second.
Okay, so we've covered the conceptual difference and sort of basic architectural idea that could enable us to do that, and we'll talk about the next step and the kind of final enabling technology in a second. But if we take this as the principle, then the idea is what that's going to allow us to do is, coming back to the circle of where we started in this presentation, it's going to allow us to change that overall approach to testing, the amount of resource we need when we can actually execute it. It's going to allow us to, as you said, turn that pyramid on its head.
Absolutely. And so if we have a way to reliably able to identify, these different business activities that they're at the appropriate point in the state for testing that we want to do, we could do a mass volume of them because they're simple, they've got defined scope. I mean, there's all kinds of advantages to doing it at the activity level as opposed to the end-to-end level that we've already talked about. And that could become the great body, our baseline of testing, to make sure that when we make change, we're not breaking our existing users or upsetting the business in terms of its ability to perform. The other thing that happens is, because we've got all of these activities operating at a much sooner and smaller scale, we can actually shift this testing left. And as a developer, that might mean doing a transport of copies into a sideline QA environment, doing all of your regression testing before you even go to your team lead and say, my transport is ready for release, and move into the actual QA environment. Think about being able to remediate all of the changes you've made against regression before you even release your transport. So that's not really been possible in SAP before, and it's a big story. Then stacked on top of this is the kind of testing we've already done. You still need to do integration testing to make sure your interfaces and all of that are still working. And you still need to do end-to-end. You still need to make sure that final assembly right before production is ready to go live. That's what we would call smoke testing. But you don't need to do that much of it, right? Because after all, you've already guaranteed that all the functionality has been correctly addressed. That's working. Now we're just making sure the wiring of the systems together is functioning as designed right before we go live. And so the pyramid looks much more like this, with a great body of the testing happening much earlier in the outcome life cycle or the release life cycle than was possible with EndtoEnd.
Okay, so we've talked about an idea. We're in a Basis Technologies webinar. I'm sure we won't surprise anybody if, when we go on to the next slide, we talk about how Basis Technologies can help companies realize this idea that you talked about and make this kind of change. So tell us a bit about testimony and how that works.
Well, in short, testimony was a vision to solve the regression testing problem that existed in SAP. That there's lots of testing tools available for SAP. And frankly, when it comes to running a test, they all do a pretty good job. That's fine, they're capable of it. What they can't do is understand what the test should be and automatically understand how to execute that test. We get back to this problem of end-to-end that we're using to create tests in these solutions because it's logical, it makes sense, we got to have preparation of test data and all that. Well, what if we could have a system that would just look at production, discover that day in the life of the business, automatically bring over a system copy and correlate that then with all of the different tests that need to be run at the right moment in time, that are in the right state, that are at an activity only level. We'd solve this problem of of end-to-end tests producing output that you have to go then diagnose to understand where the failure actually was. We'd know what activity it was in instead. We'd have voluminous numbers of small tests that could be run very early in the testing cycle. We'd provide much more coverage, after all, a full day in the life of business than would be possible with any other methodology. And frankly, the best part of it all, we wouldn't have to write and maintain scripts or mess with test data because the system had automated those problems out for us, right? And those are heavy lifts with other automation. So this is what to me is so unique about testimony, and why I think for SAP regression testing, it's just fundamentally a better approach.
So a couple of big claims in there, which have been hinted at in the more conceptual part of the webinar. Getting away from concern about test data, and as it says on the screen here, basically eliminating test scripts, getting rid of test scripts from your regression testing effort. So let's just dig into how that's actually possible and how testimony can help to achieve that, because I'm sure that's in people's mind.
Yeah, it's a big claim, and it's relatively easy to explain how the system's capable of doing this. So the secret sauce of testimony is that here at Basis, we've developed an instrumentation capability for ABAP. Those of you that have done C# or Java programming may have heard of bytecode instrumentation. This is something similar in concept, except it's at the ABAP layer itself. So the way that our solution works is we will literally record a day in the life of a production environment. Our solution in a production environment, capturing every single batch job, every single dialogue transaction, every single BAPI, every web service, you name it. If it happens in an SAP system, we're able to see that, and we're able to take a copy of that. So at the same time we turn on that recording capability, we also take a system copy of the production environment. And that system copy becomes our, what's called pre-QA or disposable copy in this particular diagram. And I call it disposable because we're going to burn it up and we're going to throw it away, and we're not going to care about the fact that we do that because the testing is going to automate all of this work for us. So in that disposable copy, we're going to go ahead and transport in our release candidate, any changes that we want to verify. And testimony's magic is that it will literally set the clock back on this test target system and replay that entire day of business that we've recorded previously. Because of the system copy, we're in perfect state to actually repeat the exact same transactions and performances and even integrations that occurred during that business day. And we're doing it against that new revision of code and changes that you've brought into this test environment in order to verify that everything is actually going to work correctly. So this is such a neat approach because it's so much more coverage oriented in that it covers an entire day of business or more, depending on how much you record. And it's much more robust in terms of performing literally thousands of different types of transactions and variations, doing it on an individual transaction level, because after all, that's the way we've been able to abstract this information out of the system and been able to re-execute it because we've got a system in a known state. It's just a very clever approach to being able to much more robustly regression test SAP.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So that's, I mean, it's a pretty simple, if somewhat revolutionary concept. I know there can be a lot of specific technical questions around that, which we're not going to dig into the webinar today. But of course, if anyone in the audience does have more specific questions they'd like to discuss, we'd be more than happy to follow that up afterwards. Maybe enough about our solution and Basis Technologies for a second. Let's talk about a real world scenario. Let's talk about somewhere where testimony has been applied and they've seen some benefit from taking this different approach to regression testing. Talk to us about this slide that's on the screen and the oil company we've been working with to implement testimony in their systems.
Yeah, we see a lot of this type of demand from the energy sector, but from all sectors as well. And right there at the top, you can see the big challenge. They had automated testing. They were at a relatively low level of coverage. Problems were sneaking into production. Code changes that weren't ideal were making it in because they simply didn't have enough testing. And so they challenged us to be able to provide a much higher degree of testing coverage, but do it with actually less resources than they were using with their existing test methodology today. And they wanted it to work for both ECC and ultimately in a post-migration S/4HANA environment. So what we were able to deliver with several recordings, was an over 70% regression test coverage of all the different transactions used in ECC, up to 75% coverage of critical business transactions in S/4HANA. We did all of this without writing by hand a single test script or having to maintain anything and test data. We were also able to play back these tests much faster than real time. So we were able to shorten the testing window considerably for them, not only in reducing all of the labor of creating and maintaining scripts, which of course can be weeks and weeks, months even, but also in the actual cycle time to be able to physically play those back against the target system very quickly. But I think the real winner here is that we did all of that and we didn't have a single additional testing resource in order to be able to achieve it. Because after all, automation is solving for a lot of these problems with testimony.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Jim. I think that's it's a powerful story there and a good way to bring things to a close because we're nearly getting up to time. So just to quickly summarize what we've talked about today, we've covered this concept of end-to-end and why it exists and the pros and cons of it, but we've also posited this idea that there's a different concept that we could consider for our SAP regression testing that leverages the system copy capability in SAP and a business activity level approach. And obviously there we've just talked through a testimony from Basis Technologies and the robotic test automation technology that it contains as a way to take that new approach to SAP regression testing and move away from test scripts and towards much higher test coverage. So thank you all for joining us today. As I mentioned, there's some contact details on the screen, so you can go to our website if you'd like to either talk about a demo of testimony or if you've got any questions that you want to dig into. We've also got Jim's email address on the screen there, so you can contact him directly. I do note that a couple of people on the call have had audio issues, and I apologize for that, but just to reiterate, we have recorded this session and a link will be sent out to everybody who registered. As I say, it should be in the next day or two. So if you don't see that link, do please get in touch, but hopefully you'll get that soon and you should be able to catch up with anything that you may have missed during the session. So just before we finish, a little bit of Q&A. Just going to take a look at these here. So Jim, we've got a question here. How do you deal with connected systems, e.g. S4 and a separate EWM system?
Yeah, that's a pretty common question. So you basically have two options with testimony. The first option is the most common because it abstracts the test target away from that dependency. So what we would do in that situation is built into testimony is the concept of service virtualization. During recording, it would have captured all the interactions between the source and target systems. And at playback time, it would then emulate them, either pretending to be the inbound or the outbound system and emulating those protocols. So that gives you an opportunity there to be able to perform the test playback without any other systems connected to it, essentially isolating it away. Again, a very common technique outside of SAP, but rather new to SAP. Sometimes, though, it might make sense to go ahead and test the integration itself. And in that case, you could simply have those systems linked in a normal way and that dependency satisfied in a normal way. And the system will be none the wiser. We go ahead and run the test as normal.
Okay, we've got a couple more here. A paraphrase here, but what kind of scenarios do you recommend using testimony in? For example, upgrades. Is that a common use case or a suitable use case?
Yeah, it's probably the most common use case right now, simply because upgrades generate a ton of unpredictable change. It's very, very difficult to understand what a kernel patch might do to your business process, right? So in those cases, what you're trying to do is test as absolutely much as possible because you just simply don't know what the impacts would be. But to put a word to what testimony does best, I would use the word regression. Looking for anything that might break the way that you're doing business today, that's what testimony is extremely good at identifying and helping you understand.
Okay, cool. Quick question about the system copy aspect. One of our audience has asked how that disposable copy would be different from a typical pre-production testing environment.
Yeah, it's not much different, but it's probably not a member of your transport path, and you probably didn't run BDLS on it. So it's a simpler copy, it's basically a database restore. It's really what it is. And so because of that, you're not going to have it. You're not going to worry about moving transports through it in a traditional way. You're not going to worry about managing in a traditional way. It literally exists there to restore that copy of production from a known point in time, run the tests against it, and use it as the harness for all the testing that needs to be done in that particular regression cycle.
Okay, interesting question here. Throw a toughie at you. There's a question about use of testimony in an implementation project and how that could be done, or can that be done, when the production systems and the business activity doesn't actually exist there.
It can, and we've had customers explore this, but again, what testimony is very good at is regression testing. So when you start getting to your second and your third and your fourth sprint, and you're asking the questions, did we break the functionality that we've already delivered? Testimony could be a really powerful answer there, because it will automate the testing of all of those things. But what testimony is not really good at, and I wouldn't recommend it for, is for new feature testing. When it hasn't had an opportunity to observe the feature being used and users performing against that system, then it doesn't really have a way to learn those elegantly. We have a way, but not elegantly. And so I think it's less ideal for that. So back to the idea of upgrades, regular business as usual change, the place where regression testing to do comprehensively is prohibitively expensive. That's really the sweet spot.
Okay, great. I think we're just about slightly over time, in fact. So I'm just going to throw one more quick question here, because I know it comes up a lot when people see this technical possibility of testimony. How long do you typically need to record for to get a confident level of coverage in those business processes? Again, I've paraphrased there slightly, but how long is a typical recording to give you the equivalent of end-to-end?
Well, it's going to vary. If you have a very busy system with a lot of business process in flight, it could happen in mere hours. If you have, a less busy system with fewer longer running processes, it might take longer. We're getting into implementation here, but one of the things that we do is go ahead and pull all your workflow data during the course of an implementation. This helps us do two things. One, make sure that we're getting really good coverage, that we're actually testing all the things that need to be tested. But two, it also informs us when the best time to record is in order to get that really good picture for the least amount of work. So that's all part of the methodology that we use when we go in and work with a customer on implementing the solution in their environment.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we're going to call it a day there. Jim, thank you so much for your input into this webinar. Of course, anyone who's still on the call, if you would like to have a follow-up conversation or have any questions that you think of after the session, do please feel free to get in touch. Just to repeat, this has been recorded. A link will be sent out. Please be a little patient with us. Give us a day or two, but if you don't see that link, just get in touch and we'll make sure to get it to you. And of course, we have a regular series of Basis Technologies webinars that are always advertised on our website around these topics of DevOps and testing for SAP. So do remember to check back there and see what's coming up in the near future. In the meantime, thanks very much to everybody who's joined us today, and we hope to see you again soon.